Support for the Choral Commons comes from the University of San Diego, the Karen and Tom Mulvaney Center for Community, Awareness and Social Action, and the College of Arts and Sciences Arts Engagement Initiative.
USD's Arts Engagement Initiative supports artistic action embedded in and responsive to ever-changing social, cultural, and political circumstances, deep and meaningful engagement with community, and increased access to the arts on the USD campus and beyond.
The Choral Commons is a community where choral music practitioners and organizations can gather in order to envision equity-centered choral futures. With our community and creative partners, we hope to empower choral practitioners with additional strategies for innovation grounded in culturally responsive, critical, and equity-centered values.
My name is Emily Amrine.
And I am Andre de Quadros.
And this is the Choral Commons podcast.
When I wrote my dissertation, I remember there was a sentence there that really triggered my my committee because I wrote something about that we need to take off our blinders to this idea that choral music is universally good, because choral music, the way it's practiced in many of our countries, is modeled around colonialism, is modeled around so many things that are not ethical or valuable, and there's no better model for that. No better evidence for that. That the fact that totalitarian regimes love choral music. The big cantatas and nationalistic stuff, they love choral music because it enables them to promote conformity, to promote this idea of propaganda, of furthering a culture. So it's not universally good. We have to be conscientious about the values that we promote in our rehearsal space, in our programming, and so I really feel strongly about this idea that as choral directors and practitioners of this music, that we have to be deliberate about our actions and about our relationships.
In her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the great Chicana poet, author, and activist Gloria Anzaldúa writes, "Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants." Recently, the field of choral music has begun to extend the work of social justice to borders and the harm they cause. As we struggle for ways to understand the lives of refugees, immigrants, and the displaced through music, we find ourselves seeking to engage deeply with the prohibited and the forbidden. How can we get close? How can we listen deeply? How can we compassionately reflect these stories in our music making? Ahmed Anzaldúa is a Mexican choral conductor, classical pianist, and music educator of Egyptian descent. He is the director and founder of Border Crossing, a Minnesota-based organization dedicated to integrating historically segregated audiences, repertoires, and musicians through the performance of choral music. Founded in 2017, Border Crossing envisions fundamental change in classical music culture so that every concert, every audience, and the artists on stage truly reflect the cultural reality of the community. Their work provides opportunities for people from different backgrounds to understand each other in new ways through their multilingual Puentes concert series, educational programs in schools, and collaborations with Minnesota-based arts and cultural organizations. So, Ahmed, I'm wondering if
I think that there have been these conversation threads with several of our recent podcast guests with regard to kind of racial, cultural, and ethnic identity, and how people negotiate identities that are both dynamic and changing and intersectional. I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about the idea of diaspora, right? This idea of being a part of a community. Do you identify, what is your experience in regards to diaspora?
What I've found is that as I come to a new place, my identity is sort of slapped on me by the society where I'm in. Because, being uh, at least being sort of Mexican, Arab, white, it's intersectional and kind of ambiguous. So if I'm in Mexico, I am white. I am not. No one will see me and say, okay, he is indigenous. He is Raramuri or Mexica or Purepecha. Like I'm white. I'm very sort of European passing, sort of Anglo. So my entire time living in Mexico, I just thought, well, I'm white. I'm one of the white people. And then as soon as I came to the United States, it became very clear to me that at least in my interactions with employers, with other people, with friends, with society at large, I was not white. I was some sort of other thing. So then you start having to be a little bit more careful about the way you present yourself, whether you are enforcing certain stereotypes or not, or fitting certain mold, and how you want to play it up or play it down. And that was also my experience going to Spain. When I was in Spain studying there for 4 years, there's extraordinary racism against South American immigrants there, as particularly people from Peru and Ecuador. They just call them Sudacas. And people would call me Sudaca, and they would say, well, I'm from Mexico, because they would notice my accent. And then they're like, oh, okay, so you're one of the good Sudacas. And when I was in Egypt, not being a fluent Arabic speaker, and even though I very much looked like most of my Egyptian friends, I was also not very, at least not considered as Egyptian. And definitely, I know that here in the United States, whenever I go to a majority like a mosque, or even when I get into an Uber that's being driven by someone from a Muslim country, I will get chastised, because they'll immediately ask me if I speak Arabic and when they found out I'm not Muslim, I'll get scolded at, and they'll start saying that my mother didn't educate me correctly or something. So diaspora, it's odd. It's just odd and fluid, and at least from my perspective, it is so centered around constructs that people just sort of pull out of thin air that have no basis in reality. Just thinking about family history. So my first name, Anzaldúa. So the Anzaldúas were sort of Spanish explorers who arrived in northern Mexico with the Franciscan friars, and they sort of populated the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas and northern Mexico, and in the 1700s. And something that happened is that a lot of Anzaldúas were farmers in that area, and then the Mexican-American War took place in the mid-1800s, and the border was redrawn. And then a lot of Anzaldúas all of a sudden weren't American anymore. They were Mexican, and then some of them had to cross the border without documents to get work at the farms that they had owned a few decades before, that their grandparents had owned. So overnight they became something else, and it's just I guess a byproduct of living in that border between the two countries and for generations. When I wrote my dissertation, I remember there was a sentence there that really triggered my my committee, because I wrote something about that we need to take off our blinders to this idea that choral music is universally good. that it is that there is because choral music, the way it's practiced in many of our countries, is modeled around, colonialism, is modeled around so many things that are not ethical or valuable. And there's no better model for that. No better evidence for that. That the fact that totalitarian regimes love choral music. The big cantatas and nationalistic stuff, they love choral music because it enables them to promote conformity, to promote this idea of propaganda, of furthering a culture. So it's not universally good. We have to be conscientious about the values that we promote in our rehearsal space, in our programming, and so I really feel strongly about this idea that as choral directors and practitioners of this music, that we have to be deliberate about our actions and about our relationships. And so for me, it is very, very difficult it is extraordinarily difficult, if not, I would say, nearly impossible to completely disassociate yourself from these structures, because they're structural, because they are so deeply embedded in the way we think and everything we do. I catch myself having in so many biases and blind spots and things that I do that looking back, I realize did damage to someone or were violent in some way. So what I've come to realize over time is that for my own practice, it really helps to focus very intensely and very deliberately on this idea of personal relationship and justice in personal relationship. And that applies to how I relate to singers, how I relate to audiences, but also how I relate to a piece of music.
Can we go back to, so you could talk about three things: how you relate to singers, how you relate to audience, and how you relate to the music. So
to the music.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
to the music.
So
give us examples
central.
Give us examples of all three.
Well, so that's central. So, for example, as a pianist, I was hammered into this idea that you play Debussy a certain way, and this Debussy exists in a vacuum, and I really didn't start to work out what music could be or mean until I started to see that through a lens of personal relationship. Me and Debussy. The fact that he was a complete jerk to every single woman in his life. The fact that he lived in this society where he had a certain place in that society, trying to empathize with motive, trying to connect on a personal note with not only him as a person, but maybe other performers that have done that music and people that have been inspired by it. So in terms of the music, this idea that we, a lot of the time, and I think in a way that's very centered around fallacies, around the scientific method, and objectivity, we get taught to downplay this emotion and personal relationship aspect. And I believe that that's absolutely central to overcoming structures that are antithetical to our values. So even in the way I relate to singers, here in the United States, I found that there is the certain expectation of what professionalism means, that there's a certain distance that you have to keep. And for a long time, I tried to really do that because I saw many of my teachers doing it and many of the conductors I admired doing it. Like, okay, they are about the music. They are about the music. I remember like one very important conducting teacher I had once told me, don't conduct the people, conduct the music. And I lived by that mantra until I realized that was just complete ignorance, because the music is the people that made it, the people who are playing it, the people who are listening to it. So making a concerted effort to learn second soprano's dog's name and to see how she's feeling that day. And that is the sort of thing that ultimately results in music making that is fulfilling and that really goes somewhere, that really connects.
But does that change the way in which decisions are made in the ensemble? Is the process different in that sense?
It does, and it does in a sense that there is. It does in a sense that things are talked about. It does in a sense that at least whenever we. So, for example, right now we're trying to figure out what does performing during COVID-19 look like? What is our next season going to look like? And the way we've been approaching it is conversations within the ensemble. So we have a big Zoom meeting where I'm going to propose, this is what I've been thinking about our plan. What do you think? Let's go back and forth and negotiate and come to an understanding. So it does affect, but at the same time, there's doing things that way has also led to people trusting whomever's conducting or whomever's the soloist. Or so a lot of the way I was taught was that centering our music making on personal relationship is inefficient and compromising the quality of the product, that it wastes rehearsal time and that it makes it not sound so good, essentially. Right. And I, at least in my own music making, I found that is not the case at all. It is actually the opposite. It's more efficient because when there's trust and mutual trust, that means that there are more people that are working together towards that joint vision. And I found that at least in our performances, it's when there is a personal investment, it's more compelling for the person listening.
I want to take us to the conversation on race. We are thinking about race, and we should think about race. The brutality for centuries against African Americans is profound. The normal, so-called normal that we have had in the past is not a normal at all. We need to go for a new normal, a different, humane, compassionate, just normal. The question is that we think about identity very, very much in a particular way, and whatever that way might be, and I want to ask you as somebody who inhabits more than one identity. In other words, your background as an Arab Muslim, your identification as a Mexican immigrant, brings you into a much larger conversation about race, and it also brings you to a larger conversation about marginalization and dispossession. You must have obviously an affinity with undocumented workers whom you can talk to in different kinds of ways. You understand what they're fleeing from. Can you talk about the way in which this complex conversation about identity plays into race and therefore plays into the way in which you think we as a profession need to be making music?
I mean, here in the United States, everything's about race. I mean, race is so deeply embedded in the history of this country, in much of the Western world. I mean, it's all somehow related to race. So that's such a complex question. My thought here is, here in the United States, what I said is, when I came to the U.S., I realized that at least to the people around me, I was some sort of other. Even though if you compare, melanin levels, maybe we're pretty equally white. And when the George Floyd killing happened and the uprisings happened, something that I saw in the week following was that I got a whole bunch of requests from people that I, trusted and knew and worked with, because they wanted to get my take on race relations, on what happened. And it never hammered the point so clearly to me that for some people, no matter how enlightened or how much I admired them, Black and Latino, it's all sort of the same. It's all other. It's all non-white. And my standard response to a lot of that was, you do realize I'm not Black. I don't. Why would I have
Right. That's exactly what my question is about.
I can't talk about the African American experience. I'm not Black. I can talk to you about the relationship between the Mexican American Latinos in South Minneapolis that sort of were part of this gentrifying movement with the African American community that lived there before. I can talk a little bit about that. Maybe I can talk about immigration, but I'm not a Black person that grew up in the United States as a Black person. But the fact that I had to explain something like that, which to me seemed very, very obvious just from looking at me, really brought home just how basic and how basic the understanding of race and of society the average white American has. It's where it's all sort of the same. And so when we're talking about
it's cast within established binaries, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's all so much about, well, this must be good and this must be bad, and so much of this conversation is gray areas and exceptions, and you see it on the conservative side, and you also see it on the liberal side, this action to take a knee-jerk action and cast things aside. And it's it all comes from this place of not knowing nuance and not having this experience. So this all plays into race, and I've had my run-ins with race conversations just on border crossing. I mean, when I came to the Twin Cities, I came to the University of Minnesota. All my colleagues were white, or at least none of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota were Black. And in the conducting department, and most of their friends were white, and most of the choral singers I knew were white. So when I formed Border Crossing and we performed our first concert made up of Latin American music, all my performers were white. And the first criticism I got from many friends was, well, that's just a white group performing Latin American music. And I said, well, yeah, that's what we are right now. So I don't know. I guess that if we're talking about how race plays into all this, we need to be able to talk about nuance, but more importantly, we need to be able to very clearly talk about realities, to clearly identify what we are talking about when we say diversity, what we are talking about when we say inclusion, or when we say equity, or because these sorts of broad, fuzzy, nebulous things don't really help anyone.
Right, and these words get trafficked in different kinds of ways, and they become badge words for all kinds of ways of thinking, and when we unpack them, we might discover that we use the same word to mean entirely different things. Gloria Anzaldúa said, "Caminando no hay puentes, se hace puentes al andar." And this idea that you build the bridges as you go forward, and this idea of being creative and compassionate and really having an eye to culturally dispossessed people and so on. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, first of all, does Gloria Anzaldúa have a relationship with you?
Yeah, she's my aunt,
Right,
Tia
okay.
Anzaldúa. Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotations from my tia. I'll just start by saying we didn't have any sort of close relationship. So Gloria Anzaldúa was the very weird aunt who would show up at family reunions once in a while, and the older people wouldn't talk about her. She smoked cigars, she said bad words, she drove a big car, she was very brash. And I thought she was a cool aunt, growing up. And then in college, after she had passed away, I finally read what she wrote and just totally fell in love. So that quote, that's a play on this famous "Caminante no hay camino, hace el camino
Yes.
al andar." So you walker, there is no way. You make the path as you walk. But she talks about bridges, so it's not about making the path and then looking back at the path you created. It's about seeing where you're going and creating that bridge to where you're going. So it really is about having this vision of what things could be, and and at the problems that we're facing are so structural, they're so deeply embedded, that that vision has to be radical, and it has to just exhibit so much imagination. And it is, if we talk about what things could be, it'll sound like pie in the sky, it'll sound like utopian and ridiculous. And if you were magically going to travel in time and talk about the abundance of resources or electricity or that sort of thing to someone 300 years ago, that would have sounded completely ridiculous. So I think I think that quote is specifically about having that radical vision of what the world could be, and then making that bridge.
What I love about the idea of kind of this visioning of another possible world is also what I think Gloria Anzaldúa like is pointing to with the concept of border thinking, that like people who are in this kind of ambiguity of identity, that these identities that, as you already mentioned, are kind of imposed by social constructs that are pulled out of thin air, that this kind of experiencing of living in the border region, I mean, specifically, but also kind of metaphysically, the idea of kind of border thinking as a space of possibility, and that this visioning of another possible world might come from the ambiguity of these identities and intersections. Because, as you know, Andre and I both also work at the border. I'm living here in San Diego County. One of the things that we've experienced kind of in terms of crossing the border is just the geography. And you alluded to this a little bit already. And what it feels like to physically cross the border with this kind of militarization that has been built up over time, the border wall and the physical the violence of this border, right, is I mean, I don't mean this as a pun in any way, but like concretized in the entity of this border wall, right? I think about this in terms of monuments. So I have this really great book about the border wall as architecture and as like this kind of structural entity that can be interpreted in the same way that artistic monuments can be. I mean, of course, it's like not, it doesn't have the same intent in any way, but to kind of look at it as something that's created and communicates something, right? And what that communicates, of course, is this brutality and the manifestation of these policies that have been meant to deny and exclude and inflict harm upon other people. I'm wondering, and this is something that I've really been struggling with recently, right? In a lot of ways, the prevailing choral practice and the affection that this practice has for music of the past, in many ways, it feels like a complicated relationship with a monument, right? A historic monument. And when we've been talking about monuments recently in kind of the discourse, you know, acknowledging the history of monuments, for example, monuments to Robert E. Lee, I'm wondering, how do you feel about like the idea of kind of historic music as monument rebuilding and replicating?
There's a difference between a monument that celebrates or commemorates versus a relic of the past versus an artifact, because I think that the problem right now isn't that people don't know history, know too much history, right? They need when I perform a lot of Baroque music from Latin America, and a lot of the time I am very intentional about making sure that the composers are include indigenous voices that grew up in that system, that maybe were third generation people that knew no other system and wrote within that system. And we all never perform this music without context. So it's so much about the story that surrounds it than just about presenting just a piece of music. So going back to all this, I mean, everything is personal relationship. Everything we're doing is talking about people, how they lived in their world, how they reacted to their world, how they managed to get through life, because that's what an audience and an artist now will connect with. The idea of this composer lived in Peru during this period when there was an inquisition, where there was forced conversion of this community, where we are presenting this hymn to the Virgin Mary that has references to Quechua Inca entities in Quechua embedded all throughout, hidden in plain sight. That so it's we're talking about how this person coped with their reality, how they put forth the things they believed in, so it's about the story.
Voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks.
The idea of monuments, of the way these structures are there, of the border, everything you want to talk about. What I'm mostly interested in, because the important part is, how do they reflect how people think, how people feel, how people relate to each other? And that's what we work in with music. If I'm performing, Beethoven's Ninth, what am I saying by performing Beethoven's Ninth? What story am I trying to get across through performing Beethoven's Ninth? Why am I choosing this work over this other work? It's not so much about. It's about this idea of there's something here that I want to connect to, that I want musicians to connect to, that says something that's universal or not, or rather than I will never perform Beethoven's Ninth because I think this is a masterwork of humanity, and here it is. I got a lot of that when I was a pianist, a concert pianist, where we have our big repertoire list that we all perform, our Rachmaninoff concertos and our Beethoven sonatas. And it's just like, well, we perform them because this is the masterwork. Now, going back to this idea of the border, we see the drones, and we see the concrete walls, and we see the big fences and the guns, and Gloria Anzaldúa's writing about the border, about being a scar where things are laid bare, and you can see the difference between the places. For me, so I've been interacting with the border since I was a kindergartner. We came to the United States back then we came back later. We would literally cross the border maybe once a month to shop. And what I've seen in the last 3 decades hasn't been, I've seen a progression, and the fences are getting bigger. The guns are getting more, whatever. But what's really been alarming to me, and all of those fences and guns and radar and sentries, they're reflections of what people feel and think. And I remember that when I was a teenager, applying for a J2 visa to come to the United States as a family member was like going to get your driver's license. It was a civil transaction. You put together your papers, you took them to the place, the officers there, they're checking to see if you have all your papers, if you dotted your I's. It's not a contentious relationship. It's just a relationship where you're trying to say, well, do you have all the papers you need, or do you not? Oh, you don't have them. Okay, go back. You have 6 more months to do it. Or you need this other paper. I'm sorry. But where I've seen the huge escalation is that it's gradually become more and more an adversarial relationship. So when you apply for a J2 visa now, the person that you're facing there behind that window isn't there to check whether you have your papers. They're your adversary. They're trying to catch you in a lie. They're trying to keep you out. They're trying to inflict violence on you in some way and prove that. And in this entire process, having gone through this immigration process constantly for years, I've felt more and more dehumanized, even if the actual rules and regulations that are on paper are mostly the same. In the last 3 or 4 years, there have been some really gradual changes to the way visa processing works and all that. But most of the changes haven't been like big, eye-catching things like the DACA. I call it betrayal, or that sort of thing. But these constant little tweaks that make the process more inhumane and more adversarial.
Andre and I spoke with Ahmed Anzaldúa in early August. You can learn more about him at his website, www.ahmedanzaldua.com, and his work with the ensemble Border Crossing at www.bordercrossingmn.org.
Caminante, no hay puentes. Se hace puentes al andar. Caminante, no hay puentes. Se hace puentes al andar. Caminante, no hay puentes. Se hace puentes al andar.
The Choral Commons podcast is hosted by Emily Amrine and Andre de Quadros, produced by Emily Amrine in partnership with Chorus America and the Eric Erickson International Choral Center, and supported by listeners like you.
Additional institutional and creative partners include the Harvard Choral Program, St. Olaf College, University of Hawaii Choirs, University of San Diego, Manado State University Choir, Navai Chamber Choir, and Voices 21C.
If your organization would like to join our list of sponsors, please reach out to us at thechoralcommons@gmail.com, or consider joining our community of supporters on our website, where you can schedule regular donations of $5 or $10 a month to help us offset the costs of producing these programs.
The Choral Commons aims to provide a space for choirs and conductors to envision innovative and equity-centered practice. We produce podcasts and interactive webinars and offer curated resources on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We connect and engage community in meaningful dialogue on pedagogy and practice, and incubate creative, artistic, and compassionate choral projects that empower choral music organizations to work for a just and peaceful world. The music you heard throughout this episode featured singers from Mexico, the United States, and the Dominican Republic, who regularly perform with Common Ground Voices La Frontera. The text source for this piece was a quote from the book This Bridge Called My Back by Chicana poet, author, and activist Gloria Anzaldúa. You can learn more about this song and our creative partners on our website, www.thechoralcommons.com.